Okay, so let's get started because I see some people in the audience and I'm going to read your bios again. So we can do that while we're waiting for more people to kind of come in. So hello and welcome. This is our romance reading. We have three amazing authors who we're going to hear from, and they're going to read us sections from their books, and we're just going to kind of go down the line. Before we get started with all of that, I just want to thank our sponsors one more time. Without their support, we would not be able to put on the Green Mountain Book Festival. So thank you so much to Phoenix Books, to Fletcher Free Library, to Burlington City Arts, Hanson and DeRemus, Media Factory, Northfield Savings Bank, Pomerleau Real Estate, UVM Humanities Center, Vermont Arts Council, and Vermont Humanities. Yeah, so I'm going to read their bios again. I know some of you were here before for their panel, but for those of you who are new, on the end here we have Anne Stuart. Anne has been writing since the dawn of time. She sold her first book to Ballantine 50 years ago, and since then she's made the New York Times bestseller list, USA Today, Publishers Weekly, and maybe even the Wall Street Journal lists. She's appeared on Entertainment Tonight, won the Romance Writers of America Lifetime Achievement Award, as well as numerous Rita Awards, as well as regional awards and Romantic Times Awards. She has published with every major publisher and is now happily publishing on her own. Her next book is To Catch a Thief, if she ever manages to finish the damned thing. And then next up we have Catherine Drake. Catherine has worked for many years in the land conservation field, developing public outdoor recreation areas and preserving forest and farmland for future generations. Her first book, The Treehouse on Dog River Road, is set in Waterbury, Vermont, and was the One Town, One Book Community Reading Program selection for 2022. It was also a finalist in the 2022 Next Generation Indie Book Awards in the romance category, and it has been a bestseller in several bookstores across Vermont. And this is LaQuette. LaQuette writes sexy, stylish, and sensational romance. That means she writes sentimental and steamy stories like Hallmark movies, but with lots of sex, featuring at least one main character who always keeps it cute. She is a multi-published author and the former president of the Romance Writers of America, a 2021 Vivian Award finalist, and a DEIA activist who aims to bring diversity and inclusivity to the romance novel industry. She is also the 2016 Author of the Year Golden Apple Award winner, as well as the 2016 Right Touch Readers Award winner. This Brooklyn native writes unapologetically bold, character-driven stories. Her novels feature diverse ensemble casts who are confident in their right to appear on the stage. So these are going to be our readers for today, and we're going to start with Anne.
Okay. Well, you get your choice. You can hear the opening of my historical, which is light and amusing, hopefully. Or you can hear a middle section of a contemporary that is full of bad words and is very suspenseful. I would probably suggest I go for the historical, since both of them are doing contemporary, but I like my suspense. So what do you think? How many want the historical? Historical. Yeah. All right, historical. We'll do historical. All right. This is the cover.
Ooh,
yes.
It's a lot of chest.
It's a lot of chest, but look at that face. It's called The Absolutely Positively Worst Man in England, Scotland, and Wales. All right. It started in a card room at a gentleman's club on St. James Street in London on a sultry spring night. The heat was oppressive, a positive freak of nature, and while most members of this most august establishment remained starched and sweating, the two disgraced reprobates in the private room had shed neckcloths and coats while they continued their night of gaming and drinking. Mr. Bowden, the manager of the club, a man who terrified green young lordlings and elderly members alike, had only hesitated at the door for a moment. Their dress was an affront to the establishment, but no one could see them, and Adderley had been known to kill a man for less provocation than a complaint about his attire. In fact, he was always a disaster in a world where clothes meant everything, and it was none of Bowden's business. He closed the door quietly behind him and walked on, praying God that they left by the back door, or failing that, after everyone else had finally deserted the place. Neither of the men even noticed he'd been there. "I'm getting married, you know," George said. Christopher St. James Constant, the 3rd Earl of Adderley, the absolutely positively worst man in all of England, Scotland, Ireland, and Wales, slowly lifted his gaze from his cards to view his partner in debauchery in the wavering candlelight. Sir George Latherby was not a prepossessing sight, even when sober, and being drunk, which he most definitely was, did not improve matters. The pouches in his soft face turned pink, the malice in his eyes shone forth, and his plump lips relaxed into an expression not unlike a dyspeptic ache. Again, my condolences to the bride, the worst man in England murmured. He would drink any man under the table, but Latherby had the merit of holding out the longest, and it was still undecided who would be fleecing whom that night. Who is the poor woman? Latherby chuckled, unoffended. No one you know, you ripe bastard. She ain't seen out of good company, and you ain't seen in it. So true, Christopher, better known as Kit, said lazily. I'm a lucky man. I rather thought you weren't allowed in much higher gatherings than I am. How did you happen to meet this paragon of womanhood? What makes you think she's a paragon? Latherby demanded, tossing a card down with a casual air. Kit wasn't fooled. Even when he was on the edge of passing out, Latherby was sharper in his cards than the most talented player, and he cheated almost as well as Kit did. He could respect that. Ignoring the card, he dealt Latherby another one from the bottom of the deck. She must be magnificent to have lured you into wedlock. She's plain and quiet and disgraced. Well, obviously she's disgraced, otherwise why would she accept your offer? The question is, why did you make that offer in the first place? He lowered his gaze to his cards again, seemingly distracted, acutely aware of Latherby's slightest twitch. His drinking partner slammed his glass down on the table with an excess of goodwill and beamed at him. Why in the world would you ask? There's only one possible reason. She's wealthy, Kit said lazily, obviously, and of low morals despite her plain and quiet appearance, no doubt, if she managed to get ruined. Latherby made a derisive noise that sounded vaguely like breaking wind. But you know, the Honorable Miss Bryony Martin is as pure as the driven snow. It's her ramshackle father that's the problem. With her upbringing, not to mention her patriarch, no other man would have her. Bryony Martin? I don't believe I know the family, and I usually know most disgraced people in or out of society. Latherby shrugged. Stands to reason, they're from the Lake District, and the scandal was mostly kept out of town. He was the Earl of Doncaster, old name. Apparently Doncaster had a particular affection for one of his neighbors, and the man's wife took exception to it. Doncaster's wife? Latherby chuckled. No, the wife of the neighbor. Apparently she thought her husband should be in her bed, not with another man. She shot Doncaster when she caught them. Of course, they hushed it up at the time, and Doncaster conveniently took months to die of a septic infection, and he expired on the continent, but you know how rumors spread. And tell me why I should be interested in this? You asked, Latherby pointed out fairly. I assume it was mainly about her father's estate? Latherby shook his head, then stilled for a moment, as if the gesture had managed to rattle his brain. An impossibility, Kit thought. Whatever brain he had was thoroughly pickled on alcohol. It would only slosh. Her father was destitute, the estate left to a distant relative with a religious bent. The heir had the manor house in the Lake District burned down, but the girl had an aunt, Doncaster's wife's sister, who married a Croesus. She left everything to the girl once she's married, but the chit's not accepted into the best company with such a cloud on her name. I imagine not. Society has absolutely no sense of humor. How did you happen to get your greedy hands on her? Ranelagh, or Ranelagh, I don't know how to pronounce that, which is a pleasure garden in London. Ranelagh, Latherby said triumphantly. Nothing like a pleasure garden for being indiscreet. She was there with her cousins. I was wearing my puce with the silver lining, and I dazzled her. Kit surveyed his companion's slovenly form and had his doubts. So you decided to pursue her once you learned that she was a wealthy orphan? Latherby tried to roll his eyes, meeting with minimal success, due to the number of bottles he'd downed that night. Of course not. I promised her. Easiest thing in the world. I compromised her. Easiest thing in the world. Got her lost in the woods, and Bob's your uncle. She lives with her cousins, but the family have been trying to get rid of her. They've got 2 daughters who have made their debut, and the presence of Miss Martin was making life extremely difficult. People could scarcely send invitations to the girls and exclude Miss Martin, but no one wants her around. Rather like the skeleton at the feast, don't you know? This works out well for everyone, and I only had to promise to give her a second cousin James a quarter of her exceedingly plump income. Kit raised an eyebrow. That sounds uncharacteristically generous of you, George. I didn't say I was going to. I merely said I agreed to. Once we're married, there's not much they can do about it without making their own precarious position worse. No, I intend to have every last penny and enjoy it immensely. It should keep me in style for at least 2 years, perhaps a little more. And after that, it was no more than idle curiosity. Latherby had no more scruples than he did. His friend shrugged, disposing of another seemingly random care. Then I'll go get rid of her in some way or another, perhaps take her to a trip to the continent and lose her in the Alps or something. Needs find means. Kit thought of the plain, quiet Miss Martin with not the slightest sympathy. Knowing Latherby, she'd be better off dead. And what if this blissful union produces children? The look of dismay on Latherby's face was comical. Lord, I hadn't thought of that. Hadn't thought of bedding her, in truth. She's ugly as sin, with hideous red hair and spots all over her face, and she'd be stiff as a board and cry all the time. He thought for a moment. I suppose an heir wouldn't be a terrible idea. My great-aunt could raise the brat. Ah, the joys of fatherhood, Kit said. Better go see the Sawbones then, Latherby mused. I've got the pox again, and the mercury treatment didn't work last time. Wouldn't want the brat born diseased. I'd have to drown him. It might be a girl. Definitely drown her, Latherby said carelessly. You'll stand up with me, of course. It wasn't a question. Kit lifted his lazy lids. At the birth, the drowning, or the wedding? The wedding, you idiot. Maybe the other two if I need you. Kit looked at his companion, the second worst man in England, and smiled his singularly beautiful smile, the one that always took people off guard. It would be my honor, he said, placing his final card on the table, the one that had been hidden behind the fall of lace at his wrists. And I believe you're already spending your bride's purse. Latherby blinked. Cheater, he said, amiably enough. I don't suppose you'd wait until after I tie the knot to make good on my debts. He stared at Kit blearily. No, I suppose not. I find it's always best to settle one's debts of honor immediately. That way there can be no misunderstanding about intentions. Latherby didn't make the mistake of underestimating his opponent's goodwill. Of course, he said hurriedly, we are marrying quite quickly. They've already read the banns the first time. I expect a quiet ceremony in a couple of weeks. And you really think I'm going to be willing to wait that long? Kit's voice was silken, and Latherby began to sweat. That's hardly been our arrangement. Wouldn't think of it, old man, he said hastily. I hadn't paid attention to the wager. I'm a little short this month. Had to come up with something impressive for my fiancé's ring. It was damned expensive for paste, and I'm not going to get a penny more until we tie the knot. Then I expect a trip to Scotland is in order. I'd rather hate to skewer you, old friend. Very few men have the stamina for excess that you do, and who else comes even close to matching my acts of villainy? Latherby looked particularly pleased at this encomium. We'll head to Gretna tomorrow, I promise. I'll call on you the moment I get back with your money and a suitable recompense for your wait, say an additional 10%. I believe you will owe me double, and you won't be calling on me. I have every intention of accompanying you. Town has grown so boring. I had planned to enjoy your honeymoon as much as you will. Thank you.
I love it. Great, Catherine, you're up.
Okay, I'm going to read from about a quarter of the way into my book, so I'm going to give you a little background on it.
Which scene?
Okay, so the name of the book is The Treehouse on Dog River Road, and it's set here in Waterbury, Vermont. The protagonist is Hannah Spencer, and she is taking care of her sister's 2 young children while her sister's on sabbatical with her husband. So she's up in Vermont for the summer, taking care of these 2 kids, and during the course of her just starting out, about week 2, she decides that she's going to build them a treehouse, and she has some experience in treehouse building, or in construction, I should say. So she feels like this is how she wants to spend her summer, thinking about what she wants to do with the rest of her life, and taking care of the kids, and while she dreams about what it is her next steps will be. Now, it just so happens that the house next door has just recently been bought by a young man who was a Vermonter but just recently moved back, and it's a fixer-upper, and he's out. He's working on the house, and they keep meeting, but because of circumstances, they don't really ever have a full conversation. And so she's been observing him, he's been observing her, and he thought those kids were hers, and she still thinks, when I'm starting this thing, that he is engaged to be married, because he keeps seeing her with the same woman. All right. By Wednesday morning, after 3 more trips to various lumber and hardware stores, Hannah had gathered everything she needed to begin her project. Nervous and procrastinating, she was hesitant to start the actual construction of the treehouse, fearful it would be beyond her capabilities. But she knew it was time to begin. Many times when she was at a crossroads in her life, Hannah would jump into a new and usually physical challenge. Intensely learning how to play soccer one summer right before middle school so she'd have a team to join. Training for a triathlon after her best friend in high school moved away. Swimming every day for a month sophomore year of college after deciding she wanted to change her major. And then going to Kenya to build houses right after graduating college. These change-ups came naturally to her and allowed her to plow through the transition. These physical challenges sometimes resulted in clarity and a plan, but not always the best plan. Hammering away in the beautiful countryside of Vermont would be more helpful in informing her future path than a mind-numbing computer search on monster.com. And so she began. The plans were sketchy, not as detailed as she would have liked, but she understood the general direction. Building the support framework would be the first task. She would do most of the cutting and drilling in the garage and driveway, where the wood was stacked. There were many benefits to this setup. She would have a convenient power source, and the lumber could be cut into smaller sizes before she had to haul it to the project site. A side benefit was that it afforded her the best view of Nathan next door, who was sometimes out ripping bark from logs for God knows what reason, or playing with his dog. Hannah worked all morning, assembling the 2 spreading triangular braces that would support the front and back of the treehouse. Remembering to measure twice, cut once, she sawed, then drilled the leg and crossbar pieces together. It was noon before she knew it, and she found herself hungry. Absorbed in her effort, she had not paid any attention to what was happening next door. Nathan was now outside at his bark stripping station, tearing away, shirt on. She gave a little wave as he caught her eye and went into the house. Nathan was on his 8th and final log when he noticed Hannah leave the driveway and head into the house. He had seen her when she wandered into his view shed all morning. He was impressed with her concentration. Sure, there was the occasional shit and oh hell that he could faintly hear, but all in all, she was making good progress. He had never seen a woman use a circular saw. She was cute with her short overalls, ponytail, and baseball cap, sawing the large pieces on the ground and smaller ones on top of the sawhorses. He wanted to figure out a way to speak with her again without infringing on her privacy. He could send Cooper over, but there was always the risk that the dog would run off, and he didn't want to face that again. He got 2 of his long climbing ropes and tied the dog up in a spot that would allow him to wander over to Hannah's but not take off. If Nathan had to rescue Hannah from Cooper's intrusion, well, that was just the neighborly thing to do. An hour later, plans successfully launched, Nathan walked to where Hannah was sitting on her lumber pile. She was reading her plans and simultaneously scratching Cooper under his chin. "Hey, Coop, what are you bothering Hannah for?" Nathan addressed his dog in a tone that made the dog cock his head as if to say, "WTF, you sent me over here." "He's not bothering me. We were just discussing the best approach for getting this thing mounted in the tree." Hannah held her hand to shade her eyes from the sun as she looked up at Nathan. "Do you need some help?" "I will, but not quite yet. I don't want to impose on you. Some friends offered. I'll probably get them over here tomorrow evening." "I'm around tomorrow if you need an extra hand," said Nathan. "I might take you up on that. Once I get the support installed, I can probably do the rest myself, but it's pretty impossible to erect these braces on my own. What are you doing over there anyway? She pointed to his pile of stripped logs. I'm making a wedding arbor. Check out my hands. It's been a chore stripping the bark. Nathan held out his ragged palms. Ew, do they hurt? Not at all, just dirty. But I'm glad that part's over. I'm behind schedule. When's the wedding? A few weeks from now, second Saturday in July. As he said this, he felt the vibration of his phone in his pocket. He pulled out the phone and looked at the message. It was an alert from his mountain rescue squad. He had recently joined the team, which provided technical rescue in the local area. This was the first time receiving an alert since he joined. I'm such a girl, I love weddings, said Hannah. Nathan peered down to read the message. A hiker was injured on Mount Mansfield. He felt a bolt of excitement course through his veins. He looked up at Hannah. He didn't want to cut the conversation short, but he needed to go. You should come. It's not far away, over in Waitsfield, about 15 miles from here. Yeah, I don't think so, said Hannah. I think you'll be pretty busy at the wedding. She widened her eyes and tilted her head with a faint smile. Nathan was furiously typing a message into his phone. A little, he said, not looking up. My entire family will be there, old friends, but if you like weddings and you don't have anything better to do, it might be fun for you. You said you weren't from around here. He finished typing and looked at Hannah. Thanks anyway, but I don't think so, said Hannah, abruptly looking down at her clipboard. Oh, okay. No, it was a bad idea. I gotta go. Nathan shook his phone in the air and said, emergency thing. He took Cooper by the collar and turned to his house. I'm around tomorrow afternoon if you need another hand. Be happy to help. Bye, said Hannah. Are you crazy? Grace asked her brother later that evening. What's the big deal? It's dinner and dancing and drinking, said Nathan into the phone. You don't invite strangers to weddings. She must think you're nuts. Well, in the middle of talking to her, I got a call out to a rescue. It was my first alert, and I got distracted. But she said she loved weddings. You gave me a +1, so I just went for it. She seems interesting. It turns out she's single, or at least those aren't her kids. I wanted to invite her to do something. Plus, if Lindsay gets all batshit crazy, I'll have a buffer. I'm sure, what's her name, Hannah, would love to know that she's going to serve as protection from your still into you ex. I'm glad she said no, which makes me like her. All women love weddings, Nathan, but it doesn't mean you invite them to your sister's wedding when you just met them. Have you never seen a rom-com? It doesn't matter. She said no. No harm was done, except now she probably thinks I'm weird. You think? Asked Grace. I can stop there.
All right, up next we have LaQuette.
Alrighty, so just a little backstory. This woman named Asia owns a ranch that's been in her family for generations that she's trying to turn into sort of a work release program for paroled women. And unfortunately, someone is trying to stop her from doing that. There's been some incidents on the ranch that have raised concern, and the most recent is that one of her barns was burned to the ground and she almost died in it. So her uncle, who is a judge in their town, decides to call in the Texas Rangers to find out who is doing this and to protect his niece. Only she doesn't really like the idea of having strangers on her land and in her business. And so she and the head Texas Ranger are butting heads as a result of it. But now he doesn't really understand why, like, to him it's just a piece of land. He doesn't really get why she would risk her life for this land. And so this scene really helps him to understand not just why she's so determined to build and rebuild, but who she is as a person. Asia took a sip of her second cup of coffee while she thought about the visiting cowboy upstairs. She glanced down at her trembling fingers and regretted her compulsion for more caffeine in her system. Get it together, girl. He's simply a cowboy doing what your uncle told him to do. No need to let his presence rattle you. The pep talk sounded good to her ears and her head, but somehow she didn't feel the usual comfort her self-affirmations brought. She took another sip from her cup and savored the sweet, creamy taste. "You ready to show me around your spread?" She took another swallow of her coffee and kept the smart retort that threatened to slip through her lips. Her uncle had made certain neither of them had a choice in this, so reminding Jackson she hadn't wanted him on her property in the first place wouldn't help them get on with this date. "Sure, it's best if we go on horseback. You ride? Is water wet?" She gave him an okay sign and took one last swallow of her drink before pouring the rest in the sink and leading him to the back door. "The stable is within walking distance of the house. I assume horseback riding will be one of the activities you offer to your guests." "Yeah, that along with good food, a spa, and rustic lodging will hopefully draw people into the resort." They walked through the back door and followed a path alongside a garden bed for a few moments. The structure they came upon looked very much like the barn that had burned down 2 days ago. A twinge of regret tightened around her chest, and she dragged a long, heavy breath in through her nose. Losing the structure wouldn't delay her plans for the ranch, but the memories of carefree summers spent in the barn made the loss meaningful in ways dollars and cents would never express. She turned around to usher Jackson inside and met the wide grin on his face. His lips were full, the corners curling as he looked around. "I take it you've spent some time in horse stables before?" she asked. His wide shoulders moved with each easy chuckle that slipped from his lips. "Yeah," he took in a breath through his nose and his grin spread wider, showing a full mouth of bright teeth. "Nothing like the familiar smell of hay mixed with animal musk. I mucked stalls before and after school at my next door neighbor's place in junior high and high school. It wasn't easy work, but the pay was good and I got to ride any horse I wanted as a work perk." Asia shook her head, biting her bottom lip to keep the smile she felt tugging at the corners of her mouth from blooming. She loved riding horses, always had, but she didn't think she could ever look at mucking stalls with the same fondness Jackson seemed to display. "Well, I hope you find mucking stalls as rewarding a job now as you did then." She walked to the end of the row of stalls until she found the two she was looking for. "I'm sure the residents will appreciate your experience." A chestnut-colored quarter horse pushed her muzzle into Asia's waiting hand and neighed excitedly at Asia's gentle touch. "Hey, Pride, I've brought you a friend to visit." Never taking her eyes off the beautiful creature in front of her, she called over her shoulder, "Jackson, this is Drew's Pride. She's a sweet girl who loves a good run. Introduce yourself and we'll take her and Shadow out for a little exercise." She walked over to the next stall to greet her personal horse. No one rode Shadow but her. But because she didn't allow it, not because she didn't allow it, but because the quarter horse had decided a long time ago that Asia was his human and wouldn't permit anyone else on his back. She stood for a moment, marveling at the strong creature. A proud, long neck, strong legs, and a shiny black coat made Shadow a horse any owner would be proud to possess. But it was his loyalty to Asia that made him more than a pet. No, Shadow was a trusted friend, a valued member of her small family. "Morning, Shadow. Miss me?" The horse bobbed his long neck up and down, giving the appearance of a nod. "Did you train him to do that?" "No," she laughed. "He loves me. It's a given he misses me when I'm not around." She returned her attention to the horse and gave his neck a few quick strokes before she waved her hand for Jackson to follow and stepped inside the tack room. She turned around to see if he'd followed her lead and slammed into a solid wall of broad, muscular chest. Slightly disoriented by Jackson's nearness, she stepped back before getting her footing. She felt herself falling until strong hands wrapped around her waist, keeping her upright. Goosebumps pebbled the skin on her arms at the firm press of his hands on her hips. The sure way he held her against him, like he was always supposed to have a handful of her beneath his touch, made her tremble with a strange mix of apprehension and need. When she finally found the nerve to look up into his shining, dark brown eyes, he gave her a playful wink and a smile that did little to dispel the nerves swirling in the bottom of her belly. "Looks like Shadow isn't the only one you can trust to keep you from falling around here." Asia swallowed hard, trying to move the ball of tension sitting in the middle of her throat. Trust wasn't the word she was thinking of right now. Nothing about the way he held her tightly against him made her trust. trust him, but worse, the way her body instinctively wanted to press closer to his heat made her trust herself even less. Jackson rode alongside Asia as she showed him her land, taking in the endless hills of vivid green grass bending to the slight breeze. It was early September. The scorching temperatures of August were giving way to 80 and 70-degree days, but soon winter would roll in, bringing chilly 60 and 50-degree temperatures, and it would hamper the ability to build on this land. Colder temperatures would make riding on horseback a little less pleasurable than it was now, too. Asia led them over a ridge to where a small hovel of a house sat. Its worn wooden planks desperately needed attention. Jackson was certain no one had lived there for at least half a century. Even out in these backwoods, building codes had to be adhered to. The house's deep lean to the left wouldn't pass the most basic building inspection. The building was old, a fact that was reinforced as they dismounted and walked closer to it. The loud wail of the brittle wooden porch steps made Jackson skeptical the planks would hold his weight. He lifted a questioning brow as Asia watched him take careful steps to where she was standing outside of the front door. "You're safe. You sure this is safe?" "Safe enough," she answered. The cavalier tone on her voice didn't bolster his confidence. But if she were willing to take the risk, he reasoned he could too. "What is this place?" "It's the original homestead from when my family first purchased this land at the end of the 19th century. He watched her run a light hand over a brittle wooden plank on the doorway. Her smooth brown features settled into a soft, gentle smile, something too delicate to touch for fear of destroying its beauty. Something so powerful he had to fight the growing need in his chest to reach out and trace it with his fingers. Slavery was introduced to Texas in 1821 when Stephen F. Austin promised white settlers 80 acres of land for every enslaved person they brought with them. Jackson knew how the frontier of Texas was settled. It wasn't something taught in public schools, but his father had insisted Jackson and his brother know where they came from and take pride in the history of their ancestors. During that migration, she continued, 6 generations ago, my great-great-great-great-great-grandfather Scipio was brought to Texas as one of the enslaved. He wasn't more than a year old when he arrived here. He was probably near 40 when the Civil War began. Up until that point, he thought he'd live and die in chains on this plantation. But once Texas joined the Confederacy and his master left to join the Confederate ranks, he escaped and fled to Galveston to help with the Union naval blockade. She stepped toward the door and motioned for him to follow behind her. He wasn't certain what to expect. If the front porch and the exterior were in such disrepair, he was sure the interior hadn't fared much better. But when he stepped through the door, he was pleasantly surprised to see a simple one-room space filled with covered furniture and a beautiful brick fireplace that looked like it might have been the center attraction for those who called this place home. It was daylight outside, but the windows were covered, so Asia turned on a small kerosene lamp on the mantel to bring a soft glow of the light into the room. The Union didn't allow blacks, whether they were enslaved or free, to join the army at the start of the war, but Scipio was a blacksmith, so the commander allowed him to work shoeing horses and making and repairing weapons. It was the first time he realized something originally intended for bad could be used for good. He'd been taught his trade to fashion horseshoes, weapons, and other ironworks for his master to keep him enslaved. Now he was using it to fight for his freedom. Jackson felt a chill pass through him as he thought of the pain and dehumanization Scipio and so many others like him would have experienced. He could feel the pain of that trauma as if it were a living thing cutting through the fibers of his flesh until it rooted itself into his soul. During the 4 years of the war, he saved every penny he made in Galveston. He could see a smile blooming on her full lips and stepped closer just to get a better view. He was there on Juneteenth when Union soldiers read Major General Gordon Granger's order upholding and enforcing Lincoln's proclamation. So as a free man, he returned to this land and found it in disrepair. Bless all the angels in heaven that his wife and children hadn't been sold off or worse. They were still enslaved on the ranch. Scipio informed them and the widow owner that they were now free. Family lore has it, he told the widow she could keep the land and he would take his family and leave her broke with nothing, or she could leave the land and have his money. What he offered her was a small fortune for the deed. She turned over the deed quickly. He renamed it Restoration Ranch because the land that was once his condemnation to a brutal life became his redemption. When the former owner cleared out, Scipio tore down all the old structures. This one was the first one he built as the owner. He made it his home. Jackson noted the gleam of pride in her eye as she spoke of her ancestor. More than a century had passed since Scipio Henry had courageously secured this land for his family. Jackson couldn't even imagine the strength it must have taken to endure fighting through the bonds of enslavement to freedom to make sure his people would always have something of their own. But watching his descendant 6 generations later, as she told this story, Jackson understood where Asia's unshakable resolve came from. For over 100 years, this land has passed from parent to child. After my aunt and uncle, I'm the last direct descendant of Scipio. I'm the last one left to carry on Scipio's legacy of restoring and rebuilding the land and our family's name. It's why I jumped at the chance to participate in Pathways. I knew Scipio and all my ancestors leading up to him would agree with my choice to help people like Seneca in Brooklyn. It's why you've got to stop whoever's trying to destroy it and me. If they succeed, there will be no one left to carry on the legacy, and everything Scipio sacrificed for will be gone. Watching Asia caress this old shack like it were a palace as she recounted her family's history eased something in Jackson. He couldn't quite identify. Why should he care that she took pride in where she came from? She was someone he'd been tasked to work with, nothing more. But knowing her past somehow made her seem planted in the land. Not merely an owner on paper, but someone whose roots were deeply sown into the fabric of the landscape. Jackson walked his sight from the top of Asia's braided hair down the deep, full curves of her body to her work boot-covered feet and back. She was confident and vibrant, qualities any man would be attracted to. But in that moment, he recognized Asia was more than her attractive parts. She was a woman committed to her family, loyal to the ancestors she'd never met. In his experience, people weren't made like this, not anymore. They didn't remain true to ideals and morals such as loyalty. It was all about individual success and happiness. Getting ahead the best way you could without worrying about anyone else. And yet here she was, a big, beautiful, and bright light, a beacon shining on him, showing him a better way, a better model of what he'd ached for all his life. His silence must have pulled her out of her musings, because she turned to him, sharing a genuine smile, chipping away at his exterior. And as he stood there marveling in her glory, the singular thought to cross his mind was, why couldn't I have met you first?
So awesome. So we have a little bit more time. I don't know if anybody has any questions for our readers before we send them down to the signing.
What was the title of the book?
Jackson.
Is that a recent one for you, or is it?
It's not the most recent. Vanessa Jarrett's Got a Man is more recent than that.
Awesome. Yeah. Any other questions at all? Okay, great. Well, thank you so much for coming to this reading. I'm going to right now lead our authors downstairs. Their books are available for purchase at our bookstore. And